And in my research...
10 years of research.
Quite a bit of research.
Scientific research points to
research at the university.
Based on the research.
This is Research in Progress, a podcast by the Research Office at the Graduate Institute.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to interview this afternoon Tanushree Kaushal, who just defended her PhD dissertation at the Geneva Graduate Institute on the topic of social finance in India. The idea of social finance is somewhat of a strange idea in the sense that it is finance that supposedly be used for social good, that promises achieving a social outcome while at the same time producing profit. So it's the intentional creation of social impact as promised by the Sustainable Development Goals. Tanushree, can you tell me how exactly you got interested in social finance?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. It's so nice to be with Lisa, my supervisor, and to talk about the whole project again. And I was thinking about this a lot, this question that we are asked, why we do the things that we do. And when I was tracing that trajectory for myself, I think it really began when I was 13 years old in 2008, when the financial crisis hit. And I remember reading the newspapers and coming across terms that I was familiar with in the English language, but I didn't understand them in this context. So derivatives, subprime, crisis, terms like this. And so I spent my entire teenage years thinking I'm going to become an economist. And that didn't really help me because that's what I pursued in my bachelor's, because economics is so bereft of any understanding of politics and power. And I think it's that quest to understand the politics of finance that drove me to explore this further. And cut to, I find myself in Geneva, where while in 2008, the crisis was seen as something bad, finance was seen as something that needed to be curtailed. But then I was back in Geneva and seeing that actually finance was being held up as this big solution for all kinds of social challenges. So I was just really curious how that came about.
Fantastic. One of the things that I find so interesting about your dissertation is that it follows the money across scales. So you actually start from Geneva, and you follow how the money moves down the ladder all the way to West Bengal, and you trace that, and you're interested in the way in which people actually labor, and you use that term labor, to create social finance, and especially also the way in which that labor is gendered. And that labor is colonial in different ways. Could you just maybe tell us first what your findings were with regard to Geneva, your study in Geneva?
Yeah, just quickly on following the money. I think that's such a underestimated methodology that maybe needs to be brought back because it's sort of sidelined in critical economic studies. But basically, as you said, I was tracing investments from Geneva's social finance investors to microfinance institutions in India, and then all the way down to the West Bengal women who were borrowing from these institutions at interest rates ranging between 26 to 32%. Now, in Geneva, I did most of my fieldwork in the social finance industry conferences, and I interviewed these people that I met, and I looked at their company profiles, their documents, their financial reports, and, especially projects that were active in India that they had on, which is really my central site. And it was striking that these kind of localized practices of microfinance, women's groups had become so globalized and financialized, and these social finance investors were so interested in investing in them. In terms of my findings in Geneva, what I saw was this strong emphasis on data and quantifying social practices through risk assessments, credit scores, household assessments, all kinds of spatial analysis. But even though there was this strong reliance on data, a lot of the language that they were using was actually a lot of language of faith. And that was really striking. So, I heard my interlocutor say that we have to take a leap of faith in doing what's good. There was also a strong sense of using the language of activism, that we are activists for change, that we are feminists who are bringing about change by transforming the lives of women in the global south. So that was really striking, how the rational data claims were propped up by these more political, moral claims as well in Geneva.
But then beyond that, actually, there's also a regulatory infrastructure that, in a sense, had to be created, right? And then you were actually moving then from Geneva to Delhi, and you're looking at what the Indian government has been doing in order to promote social finance. I mean, microcredit has existed in India, I don't know, I'm tempted to say forever, but certainly for a long time.
Yeah.
So what actually has turned this, microcredit into microfinance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think India is such a key case, not only because it's such a large market for social finance, as they would describe it, but also because it's used as a use case, that's what it's called, this example case that can then inspire similar projects in other countries, in the global south or the majority world, as it's called. But the Indian state itself, initially they regulated microfinance, or what was then microcredit, by categorizing it as money lending. So it really fell within this much more historical, long-lasting, centuries-long regulation of how to give credit to the poor, which is by labeling it as money lending. But then in 2010, the Andhra crisis hit microcredit, which is where over 200 women ended up ending their lives because of debt pressures from micro-lending. And so then this was a big debate on how to regulate something like this sector. And I trace a lot of these conversations between central and state authorities, between private finance in the courtrooms. But ultimately, what I show is that this was resolved by redefining microfinance as a financial service rather than money lending, and bringing it under a new formation of self-regulation, which is a remarkably new thing to happen. So that, I think, marks a really significant shift in the Indian state's disposition vis-a-vis finance for the poor.
So the financial institutions essentially are regulating themselves.
Precisely.
Now, whereas previously they were regulated by the states, right?
Precisely.
In India. You describe actually how these financial institutions themselves are changing, and you do a lot of really interesting interviewing there with various heads of financial institutions and institutions that were previously NGOs, I guess, in a sense. Can you talk a little bit about what actually has happened to these organizations and what they do, what kind of labor they do in this production of international global social finance?
Yeah, I mean, I was really intrigued not just by what we talked about, how money flows, but also about the cultures of finance that travel across these spaces. So when we're looking at social finance traveling to a place like Kolkata, what does that look like? The microfinance institutions leaders that I spoke with, they did a lot of representational labor. So they were trying to convert women's local economic data, their credit data, into legible visual representations for their investors and do risk-based spatial mapping. So these regions are risky, these regions are not risky. But this was also tied, and that was really interesting to me, to more localized aspirations. So for instance, these visualization practices that they used, they often had to hire consultants to do that, so international consultants or urban consultants to do that. So there was this association of this work, financial work, as being more urban and more financially savvy things being more urban. And so, yeah, the idea of doing this representational work was attached to finally being able to make it as being the big city boys. We are no longer from the city that's behind, which is always the connotation with Kolkata, but actually now we have made it.
So fascinating. You actually spent quite a bit of time also with some of the people who are engaged in the making of the loans and then in the collecting of the repayments, and you spent time on motorcycles going through the countryside of Bengal, of West Bengal. I mean, one of the things that stuck with me when you wrote about that is how gendered that labor is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think before I went to my field sites on those motorbikes, as you mentioned, I had this idea that the debt collector would be some sort of extractive money lending figure who would be forcing women to repay. But as I spent time there, I was really surprised to find that actually the labor that they're performing is often very affective, is very gendered. And so these very low paid men in deeply precarious jobs are actually doing a lot of trust building with the women borrowers and are building personalized relationships and doing a lot of care work as well for women's economic conditions, right? They're attentive to the economic conditions under which the women are repaying their loans. So the profit maximization that is part of finance was really being enabled hand in hand with this kind of affective labor that was being performed by these debt collectors, or they like to be called collection officers. So that was the term that I also use, who went door to door to collect these loan repayments. And yeah, that's precisely the labor that I emphasize to show how financial value in spaces like Geneva is really being created by this everyday wagering, this labor that's performed by, low income, not just the borrowers, but the workers of finance in spaces like Bengal.
So you have the work of the people in Geneva. You have the labor of the Indian government in re-regulating social finance. You have the labor of the heads of these organizations, the financial organizations, and you have the labor of the branch officers. And all of that presumably is in order to help or maybe extract value from local borrowers. You actually had an opportunity also to interact quite extensively with the women borrowers. So does the social finance work for them?
Yeah, big question. I mean, I did months of field work with the women who were taking on credit one after the other to survive. And I think maybe again, in this case, before conducting field work, I had an idea of the ideal woman borrower and that she would be resistant to the credit. And maybe that came from a lot of the feminist literature that I had read as well. But the reality was often more contradictory, more textured. So the women were certainly critical of a lot of things about the loans. They were critical of why is it just women who are given these loans? Why can't their husbands, men in their families, get these loans? Why are the loans micro and not bigger? That was a big concern that women raised. And but even despite that, they were turning to microfinance regularly. And some even preferred these to taking credit from family members, where they felt that there was an additional burden of shame or guilt that here they didn't have as much. So here, I'm really thinking of Nancy Fraser's work, which is so key, when she's critical of Karl Polanyi. Polanyi is, doing a lot of stuff that was key to economic sociology, where he's separating the state and the market and arguing that markets need to be re-embedded in society, right? That's the big economic sociology idea. But Fraser points out that this actually ends up romanticizing society, and it does not account for the violence that women, racialized people endure in society. So I think that's the space where markets can actually be sort of ambivalent. And I think I was really interested in that ambivalence of it can be an empowering tool and it can be a tool for violence. And women navigate that in-between relationship.
Fascinating. The real life, in a sense, in the end, is always more complicated than the theories we have to try to capture it in many ways. It actually makes me wonder about your methodology, because you're doing something very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. You go, first of all, through different layers, different levels of analysis, but you also use very different methods. So you were doing participant observation in Geneva, you were doing interviews, you also went into archives, you did a lot of reading around. So there's a lot of different materials you had to juggle. I imagine that it must be very difficult to, in the end, make sense out of the abundance of data and evidence that you must have had. So I'm curious whether you have any tips, insights in retrospect. First of all, about how to keep your story going, or to develop your story, I guess, to begin with. But then also in terms of how do you connect the global and the local, and what would you tell somebody who wants to take on a study of this sort?
Yeah, I think I realized quite early on that to look at something like finance, it has to be across different sites, and it has to be embedded in histories of finance as well. So imperial histories of finance, and spaces of power and spaces that don't have power, because north-south disparities are very much still entrenched. And my key process really was to follow the capital, going back to what we began with, and that focus on capital really helped me in making connections across sites. So even when there was all kinds of materials, which was there in my scholarship, the main question was, which directions is capital moving in, and what is this capital doing? What is it clinging on to, whether it's cultures, gender, power, risk, and so on. So I think my suggestion would be, if you're doing multi-sited research, ethnography, then follow something across the sites. So either follow gender norms or metaphors or concepts or capital, it can be anything, and to look at how these are being enacted across sites, and how they enact, across different spaces, which is also something that you said to me in the beginning of the PhD, of maybe the global is not always the global, it's also a local where things are being enacted and pursued. So I think following something helps in doing multi-sited research. Yeah.
So you took on the lessons of global ethnography, even in the field of international relations. Yeah. So Tanushree, what are you going to do with all of this now? I mean, you already have published quite a bit. I know you also have policy recommendations that are coming out of your research, but you have finished something and you're going to start something new. What is that new going to be? Where are you looking to go with this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think my big recommendation from this research, in a broad sense, is that labor and finance are not disconnected. When we think of finance, we think of it happening in certain hubs as sort of abstract, but it's actually really tied up with labor. So the ILO needs to look at not just labor in production, but also labor in finance. I think that would be my big policy recommendation. And I think going forward, something that I came across a lot during my field research was not just the use of loans, but the use of loans over tech, digital finance and digital credit. So I think the next research that I will be doing will be exploring how technologies travel across different sites and what they do, and the processes of digitization of finance.
The digital and finance, there is a lot of work waiting for you. Thank you very much, Tanushree, and good luck.
Thanks, Lisa. It was a pleasure.
This is Research in Progress, a podcast by the Research Office at the Graduate Institute.